everyone, I'm Alice Ting. I'm from DMG Media, and you probably know us as the Daily Mail website, or Mail Online. But beyond that, we also own Metro, iPaper, and New Scientist, among other properties. I have to figure out the clicker. I work in content partnerships and licensing. What that really means is I'm responsible for a lot of the relationships we have with big tech companies like Google and Meta and Apple, as well as MSN and others. But increasingly, it's more about how we navigate this world of AI and licensing content to the AI platforms. One of the things I've been seeing, and I've been in this industry now for over 20 years. Before Daily Mail, I was at the New York Times, also in a very similar role, doing licensing. And what I've started noticing is that for much of the time, licensing was this term, this area that everyone ignored because we were so focused on advertising and subscriptions. It was a nice to have. It was found money. People were happy with it, but they didn't want to be bothered with it. But now with the rise of AI, what we're seeing is that licensing has moved from being sort of this ignored term or ignored area to being the center of business strategy and part of the conversation. So what I want to do first is just take a moment to talk a little bit about the history of licensing. And this is my attempt to do this. This is not like, okay, in 2010, this is what happened. It's more of a continuum, so there's a lot of overlap. Really, let's kind of go back. So this is about 25 years worth of history. So from 2000, 2010, I like to call that the syndication era. Licensing was mostly about that. Publishers handed their content, their archives, I would say to text art aggregators and databases like Factiva and LexisNexis. It was very passive, low friction, forgotten, depending on who you talk to, maybe low return. Sorry, Factiva, not with us. And then later, 10 years later, in 2010 to 2020, we have the platform era. And this is where you have Facebook, Apple News, Google, publishers giving their content to these platforms in a contract where we said, here, we're going to give you our content, but in exchange, you're going to drive some value to us. And that value could be mostly traffic or potentially rev share, and maybe in some cases, revenue, like fees, licensing fees. It helped publishers a lot in terms of reach, but I wouldn't say it gave us or delivered consistent or durable revenue. And our role was more as a reactive negotiator. Platforms came to us, say, hey, we have this new program, do you want to participate? We, of course, wanted to, but we were really not in the driver's seat. Since 2020, a lot has happened. I would say that the industry in general has experienced a lot of whiplash, especially in the licensing field. We saw Facebook or Meta come in, work with publishers to do the Facebook News tab, which was really exciting. It was a good revenue to many publishers. A few years after that, completely dropped it and never to return. But other platforms are still supporting news, such as Google and Apple, where we have relationships. But really, it's the rise of generative AI that has changed everything. Suddenly, our content just wasn't being shared and republished on platforms. It was being scraped. It was being trained on. Derivative works were being created from it. And we need to actually take action and be proactive about it. So what that has mean is that our role as licensors and publishers is changing. We're moving from being tactical to being more strategic. And so as we look into 2025 and beyond, our role will be a much more proactive role and one seen more as a data asset owner. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So as I said, generative AI has changed the game for us. It's flipped tables on everything. Content is fueling training models. It's powering chat interfaces. It's shaping potentially digital assistants. And what publishers have seen, and I'm sure many of you have seen, is a surge in scraping of our content, a decline in traffic, referrals, and an increase in hallucinated outputs that often misrepresent our brands, and sometimes are just false in general. But the nice thing, or actually the optimistic thing, is that publishers are no longer staying silent. They are being much more vocal. They're collaborating more. Some publishers are striking deals with the LLMs, and some are pursuing legal action, and some are doing both. And so there is a lot of activity, and, and publishers are trying to be less reactive and more proactive. And why is that? Well, the AI training data set, and I sourced this from Fortune Business Insights. The AI training data set market is about to explode. So in 2024, it was about $2.9 billion. This year, it's going to end up around $3.6 billion, and then by 2032, $17 billion in value. That's a 6 times growth in less than a decade. And this growth is driven by content, because you really can't grow and improve these LLMs without really valuable quality content. And these are what the models need, and this is what we own, and this is our competitive advantage. And so really we have to think as publishers, well, what makes our content valuable and irreplaceable to the developers? Well, one thing is what LLMs really thrive on is scale. That's why they scrape the web, because you can't get any more bigger than that. But they also need structure and context. They're only as good as the data they ingest. So you know how when your parents say you're only as healthy as what you eat, don't eat the junk food, doctors say the same thing. It's the same thing with the models. If they're ingesting processed food or processed content, they're not going to be as good versus if they were actually partnering more closely with publishers. A lot of the content that's on the web is shallow and spammy. It's unverified. It's not the best quality content. However, our content is just the opposite. So this is where publishers come in, right? Models need all of this, but publishers can provide decades of vetted content, time-stamped content, verified, fact-check. It's semantically, organized. It's editorial curated. These are all things that are really important. And in addition, we offer fresh content almost on a daily basis or weekly basis, but in some type of cadence. But for us to prepare our content properly, it has to be training grade data. And that's where the conversation shifts very differently from in the past, where it was more about, here, take our RSS feed, republish the content, and call it a day. It's a very different conversation. But to do this, we really need to think about things very differently. And so proposing a framework on how to approach AI organizations. So this is the shift where we go from being reactive and playing defense to being proactive and playing offense. And we need a playbook for this that will do a couple things. It'll protect us from what's ours and prepare us for how we use the content and capture the value and then scale that value efficiently. So I have to confess, I call it the 4Ps framework, but we all know 4Ps is marketing, but I couldn't come up with a better terminology. If anyone has a better name, I am all open to it, because I didn't want to call it like the circle of value. That just sounded really terrible. So we could talk about that over drinks. But for now, I'm calling it the 4Ps of publisher. Publisher licensing in the AI era. So it's protect, package, price, and productize. So I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. In each, the most important thing, I would say, and if you're not doing this, please start, is to protect your content. And what I mean here is you can't really monetize what you don't control and what you don't know is happening to your content. So it's all about asserting your intellectual property rights, both from a legal perspective as well as from a technical perspective. You want to create friction to make it hard for LLMs and model developers to take your content. It's not foolproof. They'll still try to scrape it. I know there's the robots protocol. Some adhere to it, a lot don't. But think about it this way, right? If you are in a neighborhood and you're one of like 5 houses on a block and someone wants to steal from you, are they going to steal from the house that just has the no trespassing sign? Or are they going to steal the house that has the no trespassing sign, an alarm system, a pit bull, maybe a security guard with a rifle? So this is kind of similar. What we want to do is to be that house that's sort of on the block with all these different things, because we want to make it really difficult for them to take the stuff, because then they'll be more willing to come to the table to talk to us. So the first thing is about protecting and asserting our rights, so creating friction. And what that means is understanding what they're doing in terms of scraping your content, get the analytics and the data to help you determine that. And there are services out there, such as like Tollbit and Cloudflare and ScalePost that you can work with to help you drive that data. But then also block unauthorized bots from scraping. That's also really important. And then when needed, it's sort of a carrot stick, right? When needed, you might not want to hesitate litigating. And there are a number, I don't know how many exact, but I think there's at least probably 15 litigations happening right now around publishers versus LLMs. So that's protect. The second, and actually before I go to the second one, so why does that matter? Because without this protection, once again, we have no leverage. You can't go and say, you're taking our content, and by the way, we have proof. We could show you the data. That's a very different conversation versus going in and saying, we know you're stealing our content, we just know it. Let's get to the table and talk. It just makes the conversation much easier. So the second is packaging. So we have content, we have great content, models can come and scrape, but is that really actually the most efficient way for models? I would say no. What models really want is structured and labeled and formatted content and data and the ability to extract data. They want it easy and they want to be able to ingest it in an easy way. So packaging the content and preparing it for AI is an advantage that publishers can go into in these conversations. And that's also important because, once again, if you don't package your content, it's not really usable in a meaningful way. And if it's not usable, it's going to be harder to monetize or harder to at least extract the value you want. The third is pricing. Back in the old days of syndication, it was usually one price fits all. You might have a little bit, you might charge a little bit more from one versus the other. Maybe you segmented, maybe you didn't. It's really different now with AI because there's various use cases and how model developers access your content. Is it a one-time thing? Is it a regular thing? And so training a model is very different from providing a citation to an answer. Accessing a live feed is very different from just buying, a one-time access to your archives. And so what will be important for publishers is to differentiate those use cases and price them accordingly and being smart about the pricing. And really the goal here is to maximize value and revenue rather than have a one-size-fits-all. And then the fourth P is productize. Here it's about turning our content into something even more scalable for AI. So it's talking about which verticals, data sets are the most valuable to the AI organizations. And how do you know that? Well, because you were protecting your content, you know what they're scraping. And if they're only scraping, say, your lifestyle content and nothing else, that's a very valuable piece of information to go into in conversations. You can also build APIs. And so really the goal here is to think about how you productize this and make it scalable for you as a publisher. And really what productization does is it goes from maybe the occasional deal to something that is more predictable in terms of revenue. I would like to say that it would be great if we just did those four things and we could check off do the checklist, check it off, and be done. But actually, it's not. So really, it's more about a strategic loop, right? And it's a cycle. And if you think about it, if you protect, it builds your foundation of value. If you package, you unlock the utility and you unlock that value. And if you price, you capture the value. And finally, if you productize, you're multiplying that value. So every pass-through in the loop just means you're growing that circle bigger and bigger. And hopefully the pie is growing bigger as well. And so knowing this, how do we as publishers move forward in our role in this ecosystem? So fact. We know AI just isn't using our content. They're learning from it, right? They're distributing it in some way. They're training on it. They're forming language from it. They are deriving a lot of intelligence and extra value from it. But what publishers have that AI organizations and model developers don't have is we have credibility, we have context, and we have chronology as well as control versus what these models lack. And that makes us very powerful because we're no longer content providers. I would say that we are actually data stewards because beyond content, we also own a lot of the data that goes behind the content. So the 4 Ps, or whatever the new name will be, but not the circle of value, could be potentially a path forward and something that we at Daily Mail are thinking about for ourselves. And so with that, this is my segue because the segue into the panel, it would be great for us just to think about how we participate in this AI economy. We shouldn't be waiting to be invited in. We should be shaping it in a way that is different from the past. And with that, I'm very excited for us to kind of have that discussion, continue that discussion in the panel.
All right, right before we move into the panel, any questions from the crew? Oh.
Hi, that was great. Mike from Hearst. In your circle of value, which we're not going to call it.
Please don't call it that. I was like, oh,
we're going to keep
cringed.
saying it and so that it sticks. Do you see a world where you differentiate content in that circle where like some of it is democratized, where you say, okay, yes, you can scrape, and some of it you say, no, you can't? Or do you think you'll treat all content the same?
No, it's the former. Think about, I'm trying to think like, we all experience this, right? All the time. You have the basic, the like advanced, the premium, like a subscriptions is similar. I mean, we have to start thinking that way with a lot of the model developers. So if they want to scrape us, that's fine, but they're going to not be getting the best stuff. And frankly, maybe we should make it really difficult so when they do scrape it, they're really getting crap in return, right? To make their models not as great. I mean, I know that sounds awful, but it's all about creating that friction to get them to the table. I do think that if you segment your content and really understand the value of the content, the value that you drive to the model developers and segment it accordingly, that's going to be the way forward. Because each publisher will have their niche and their strengths.
I'm going to ask for free consulting. Thank you. Do you have any advice for publishers who might not have huge scale, might not be able to bring, the OpenAIs or do these big content deals? Like, how would you approach this if you are a smaller publication?
I think, that's a great question. I think, if you look at the deals that have been announced in the marketplace, and we don't have a deal with OpenAI, but we continue to chat with them. If you notice, most of the publishers are fairly large publishers with big portfolios. And, that sort of makes sense. In version 1.0, you go after the big players, right? I think you're starting to see a lot of publishers talk to each other about potentially forming consortiums and collectives. Because if you're smaller, if you're mid-sized and smaller, really what gets you notice is sort of, being together. And it also gives you more leverage power. So there's been a lot of conversations in the marketplace with various players around that. I think it hasn't been formed yet, but the conversations are much more active than they were, say, a year ago.
Thank you.
Before we were harnessing our first-party data, we were working with third-party data companies. They would put a script on your site. They would gather some general metadata. They would pay you. And initially, it was quite robust in terms of the monetization, but there was diminishing returns over time, and eventually, it made 0 sense. Then we were able to harness our first-party data. My question is, in the monetization of this licensing, do you anticipate diminishing returns over time, and that it's really that initial, they want all your archive data initially, and once they have that, the monetization will kind of diminish over time?
Well, archives is a one-time thing, right? So it's hard to kind of repeat that unless the market, the buyer market increases. And so we are so focused on the big model developers that we forget that there's probably going to be a lot more coming down the road. And some of them are going to be really niche. So there is opportunity to continue to leverage the archives, but the value is really on the content today and going forward, right? You need that live content. So publishers just need to know that that value exists and not to give it away so readily.
All right, I think this is a beautiful segue then into our panel. So we're going to start talking about revenue in all of its many forms as it relates to AI.